This video is the fourth piece of content for week 2 of the course Quantitative Analysis, Applied Inferential Statistics. This video introduces tools for putting code together in a reproducible fashion. I want to talk about 4 things. I want to introduce the motivation for using notebooks over typing code into the console manually. I want to talk about what notebooks are and how they work, and introduce the markup language Markdown. Finally, I want to illustrate how all of these pieces fit together with the code we've covered in the previous slides. The motivation for using notebooks is drawn in part from the previous video. As we noted, pipeable code is far easier to write and reproduce. However, if we type those pipes into the console, they are actually difficult to reproduce. So we need a way to save our code for future execution. This does not mean that typing into the console is always a mistake. Rather, it sometimes is very necessary, and it's important that you know how to do it. However, for many applications of R, using notebooks dramatically increases the reproducibility of our work. R notebooks are a feature of RStudio that allow us to combine our code with explanations of what that code does. This is another implementation of knit's logic. Often my notebooks contain far longer explanations of what the code does than the code itself. This is because notebooks are about instructing the computer what to do, but they're far more about preserving the logic of those instructions for future researchers, either my future self or a colleague. This preservation is enabled by a package called knitr. knitr gives us tools to weave our code together with narrative text that contains our explanations, justifications, and documentation. We use the narrative to explain why we did what we did and what we hope to accomplish. knitr also allows us to produce dynamic reports that are constantly able to be updated based on changes to our data or our code. When we combine knitr, pipes, and narrative text, we're living up to New's challenge of writing human-readable code. This is what a sample notebook looks like, and I've written it for this week. You can see narrative text. It has a white background, combined with a short code block that loads the tidyverse package. This code has a gray background. Here is another shot of the same notebook, which is available on GitHub. This contains both the code for producing a temporary plot, as well as the output of the plot itself. One of the best parts of the R notebook setup is not just that we can write our code in such a readable fashion, but that we get HTML output that weaves together the narrative text, the code, and the output. You can see the output related to loading the tidyverse package here. When you submit your work for class, you will want to follow this format, including an introduction and an initial section that loads dependencies, packages we need, followed by sections for each part of the assignment. Under these, we'll have subsections for each question. The narrative text shown on the previous slides is written using the markup language Markdown. Our Markdown, which works with knitr to allow you to use the Markdown syntax, is a simple markup language. That means you leave clues in the text that tell software how the text should look. There are 2 examples on this page. Wrapping text in a single asterisk tells knitr to make that text italicized. Using double asterisks tells knitr to use bold text. We have a variety of formatting types available to us. There are 6 levels of headings using a single number symbol for the largest heading all the way to 6 number symbols for the smallest. I recommend that you use 2 number symbols for main sections of your notebooks, with 3 number symbols reserved for subsections for each specific question. You can italicize text and bold text as I noted previously. Specifically identify quoted text that you wish to appear differently from the main body. And use single backticks to indicate that text should appear in typewriter font. This should be reserved for references to packages, data frames, and variables, as well as GitHub repository names. There are also a number of ways to make bulleted and enumerated lists using asterisk symbols, dashes, or numbers. And finally, it's easy to include hyperlinks to websites or embedded images in our woven documents. Here in RStudio, we have a new project that contains both the project file and an rmarkdown file called week 2. And I want to start by showing you how to create a new R notebook. What we'll do, we'll go up to the toolbar and click on the new file icon and choose R notebook. This will immediately open up a notebook file that you can begin working with right away. Alternatively, you can go to the File menu, choose New File, and then our notebook. The notebook contains Markdown syntax, which you can see here, including examples of hyperlinks and italicized text. Above that syntax, there's a header, and in the middle, there is a gray code chunk that you can execute by clicking on the green play button. When you execute the code chunk, output will appear below, which you can easily close. The first thing that I do when I open up a new notebook is I will highlight the text in the body and delete it. I'll also change the title of the notebook in the header. Once that's done, we can save the notebook file. You should be immediately brought to your R project for saving. And we can begin typing text into the body of the file. I'll start with a second level header called Introduction. Write out a small introduction to my notebook. I'll do a second header, also the second level, called Dependencies. And I'll note the packages that my particular notebook requires. These are the pieces of software we depend on, in this case dplyr and ggplot2. To add a new code chunk, go to the Insert menu and choose R, and you can begin typing R syntax into that code chunk. So I'll use the library function to open up dplyr, and the library function to open up ggplot2. From there, I can add another second level header that refers to the first part of the work I want to accomplish. Below that, I'll add a third level header for question 1 and begin addressing that question. So we're asked to create a new data frame from the MPG data. We'll add a new code chunk, and we'll type out our syntax for assigning data to that new data frame. If we execute this code chunk, we'll notice a problem. We get an error saying that MPG is not found. And that's because we haven't executed that first code chunk yet. This is an important point to remember about our notebooks. The code chunks must be executed in the proper order. Executing the second chunk before the first chunk, if it depends on it, will cause errors. So we'll go ahead and execute that first code chunk, which loads the 2 required packages. And then we'll go back and execute our second code chunk again. And if we look in the environment, we can see that the AutoData data frame is now present. Alternatively, we can click on the middle button in the code chunk. That will execute all code chunks prior to the chunk we execute that button in. Once we execute all the prior code chunks, we can again execute the individual code chunk we're focused on, and our data will be created. We mentioned before that our narrative, code, and output are all woven together into a dynamic document, in this case, an HTML file. In the file selector, we can click on that HTML file, and we'll be given 2 options. One of them is to load it in our browser. When we open it up in the browser, we'll see that only the header appears. And this is because we've forgotten a crucial step. We forgot to save our Markdown file. So we'll click the Save button, and then go back to the web page and reload it. And there we are. We have our woven file that combines narrative, code, and output, though In this particular case, there isn't any output yet. We can close that file, return to our RStudio session, and load the other R notebook that's in there. This is the R notebook you have access to through GitHub, and you'll see that it contains examples of the syntax for this week, narrative text, and a number of Markdown examples as well.